start with the presentations of each of you, so I can know a little bit what your personal narrative is, and I'll try to maybe get the Zoom link to a few of the people who wanted to watch the webinar, so they can at least be attendants, if not panelists, to the seminar. Yeah, give me a second. So, sorry for this. Unfortunately, I had told a few people that they could follow our discussions today, and so now, of course, that's a bit disturbing. Well, welcome to the first session of the problem of narrative in visual arts, which is a follow-up to my first seminar at the New Center, which was about the problem of narrative more generally. Give me a second. Yes, there's a question. Aha. You're not, okay. So you're not an attendant. I can, I should be able to promote you to attendant. Okay, to be a panelist. All right, good. Okay, so again, welcome to the first session of the problem of narrative in visual arts. A seminar which is a follow-up of sorts to the general seminar on the problem of narrative I've given in the last semester at the New Center, where we were talking about narrative and the role of identities and so on and so forth, or how narrative influences identities and more general questions on narrative. But I personally have been working on the problem of narrative in visual arts for over 10 years, because I did it in my PhD already since 2006 and have published quite a lot on the subject. And this seminar will for me be a first chance to kind of discuss some of these themes with maybe some people who are coming from the art world. I've done some workshops, but haven't ever done a sort of academic seminar with people from the art world. I've done it in art history and philosophy before, and also maybe more importantly, to discuss my own contributions, because very often people are very shy at discussing my own contributions, their own contributions in their seminars. And in this case, the New Center invited me to also do that. So on the reading list, there are some of my own essays this time, and it's also very exciting for me to get a chance to discuss them with you. But before we talk more, maybe you can introduce yourself and tell me a little bit what mattered to you in terms of the subject, why you were attracted to the subject, what you're maybe hoping to see here, find here. And then I'll tell you a little bit more about my own biography and what my relationship to the subject has been, before we go into discussing Lessing and a little bit more. Nue, do I say that right? Do you wanna start? Nue, would that be all right? You're the first on my list right now.
Yeah, you can hear me, yeah.
Amazing.
I'm in Nairobi, Kenya.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe let me just switch on the light a bit. I'm a writer.
Okay.
I don't know, do like fiction or write about things that I see here at home or elsewhere. I think around art and music and poetry.
Mhm.
So yeah, I'm looking forward to this seminar. Yeah.
So you write art criticism, or art catalog texts, or what's your relationship to writing about art?
I don't know. Maybe it's like everything in that's there in like art writing, or like maybe reviews and forming like and responding to maybe theories and whatever the art practice I maybe partaking at that moment, because maybe also has to do with how someone maybe can say practices art. Yeah, like now even like, yeah, so whatever that's happening, so it's not something that's constant, always changes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. And what are you kind of expecting, or what are you looking for? Are you looking for new tools to write about art, or the subject of narrative? Does it kind of connect your different writing practices? What are you mainly looking for in the seminar?
Maybe, I don't know, to find new ways of maybe thinking also about art, and just to learn something maybe different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Maybe Alexei, you want to go next?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Alexei. I'm from Minsk, Belarus. I have very little background in arts. I'm coming from post-colonial studies, gender studies, and from cultural studies in general. But I wanted to take a course from this art track, and I really like this course, and I like the description that you gave on Instagram, so I was eager to join. And I don't know, in general, I'm more familiar. During my master's and bachelor's, I took several courses on film studies, and they have a very specific way of working with narration in film. So I thought that this course would be nice for me in terms that I can approach through at least the lens I know at least a little bit in this background into artistic practices like painting, and I like the readings for today. So I'm really looking forward to this course.
Okay, so you had a chance to go through the readings.
Yes, yes.
Amazing. Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you very much, Alexei. Perhaps Alex Cruz could go next. Is that okay? Do you have a video?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Cruz. I am an interdisciplinary artist and a writer based in Oakland, California. My body of work is, much of it is time-based, and it explores philosophies and politics of new media, although I've never really studied or practiced art in an academic context. My practice is heavily research-based, and that sort of forms the basis of my interest in narrative as a tool. In particular, like in what ways does nonfiction or didactic work rely on narrative structure? So that's a question I'd be interested to explore more in this course. Thanks.
Amazing. Okay. Thanks. Romulo, do you want to go next, maybe?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, because my microphone is kind of shit. But yeah, My background is in media studies, and I'm based in Brazil. But I'm also a writer, and I was always interested in theory of narrative, and especially like structuralistic theories and mythology and things like that. So I was like Missale Eliade and this sort of stuff, so in symbolic forms. So I was interested in how this would apply to contemporary art, and I was also very interested in the Nelson Goodman's theory of word making, and I saw that was on the syllabus, so that's why I picked the seminar.
Okay, cool. Yeah, the text by Nelson Goodman we'll be discussing is a specific text on the question of visual narrative, which isn't that famous actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, so called Twisted Tales, published in a paper and then in a collection of essays that Mitchell edited called On Narrative. And yeah, it's a kind of original approach to the question of narrative in visual arts, which has a lot been discussed from the side of narratology.
Yeah, I had never heard of that text. I only know him for the languages of art and the ways of word making.
Mm-hmm. Okay, nice. Thank you. Emilio, would you go next? Is that cool?
Hi, my name is Emilio. I'm originally from the Dominican Republic in Cyprus, but I'll be joining you from Arizona at the moment, where I'm doing a PhD in media art science, which is a transdisciplinary sort of PhD. My background is more on philosophy, and I've done film studies and mathematics. And I've read in the past things like medium specificity modernism by Greenberg. And when I did my master's in London at the CRMP, so I'm familiar with some of those subjects, but I've recently been making more videos and installations. So I want to see a bit how this will inform my practice more than theoretically. I'm more interested in the sort of practice.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as you'll see, and maybe already kind of grasped a little bit from the readings, we'll mainly be focusing on non-time-based arts, which I think is interesting insofar as it could be seen like the kind of building blocks of time-based works in the end. So the single image, or maybe an installation which is basically space-based, being the smallest building block of comics as well as of films in the end. So my idea was always to first look at what can you actually convey, how can you convey a story with so little, and if you can, in French they say qui peut le plus peut le moins. When you can do with so little, you can do when you have a medium which is much more let's say naturally prone to convey time-based events and so on. So that's kind of one of the focus. But we can, in the last session, as maybe you saw, is still, I left it relatively open because I wanted to see what emerges from the 3 first sessions and see what would be the things that you would like to discuss in this very last session, and also to give us a chance to then look at works that you find particularly complex or interesting in terms of narrativity, so we can discuss those together. And that's something I want to do during the whole class, to go between theory and analysis. So always bring in examples that we discuss, and then go back and forth with the theory. Well, thank you very much, Emilio, and maybe William could go next.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Will Hallett. I'm a certificate student in the transdisciplinary research So sort of like a media sort of like interdisciplinary work. And I think for this class, I'm interested in, I think just, I'm excited about the narrative and narratology sort of in general, because I don't, seem sort of maybe, it's not really in vogue. It's not really in fashion these days. So that's exciting. And I think maybe some of the words caught me, like structuralism and like structuralism in media studies. And then also just like writing and thinking with the idea. And I'm excited to look at the art as well. I wasn't familiar with too much of the names that were listed.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Very nice. Okay. Well, looking forward to following through. Yeah. Maybe Georgia. That's okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Nice. I'm Georgia. I'm from Greece. My background is from architecture and digital arts. And my practice is mostly digital, virtual, interactive environments. And I'm interested in the concept of narrative as in speculative scenario building means. And because in digital media there is still some imagery you have to handle. I'm very interested in seeing how you can translate from the one medium to the other.
Okay, so translations from one medium to another. Okay, cool. Yeah, it's a big issue right now in narratology, the question of transmedia narratives and transfers and different, say, specificities of different medias for narrative and the limits. So that's something that's going to be key. Thanks, Georgia. Well, maybe who else? Lena, are you?
Hi. Hi, my name is Lena. I'm based in Germany. I studied art history, so that's my background. And I work as a curatorial assistant or curatorial worker, Mitarbeit, we say in Germany, in a Kunsthalle. So for me, narrative comes from two ways. I'm interested in the narrative of artworks in general because of the exhibitions we do, but also in telling the story of artworks to our audience. It's like that. Like if we write text about artworks, what kind of narrative you give people to understand an exhibition. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be my background.
Ah, nice. Yeah, that's actually something I'll talk briefly when I introduce my kind of way to connect to that theme, because I've really gotten interested in exhibitions as narratives lately. So that's kind of the next step once you've looked at how individual works convey stories or have narrativity, just a bit below conveying a full-blown story. We'll talk about that a little bit, but have narrativity, then to look into how an exhibition itself tells a story and how you decide what stories you tell with an exhibition.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe if that's something interesting for many of you, we can even look at that a little bit in the last session more closely. Nikita, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hello. So I'm Nikita, I'm based in Moscow and I work at the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art, and I'm doing web development for the museum, and I'm also a research curator for Garage Digital, which is a program that supports artists that deal with emerging technology and new media, and we're planning to have a kind of a sub-program on artistic journalism and like artistic investigations, and look at how artistic research creates narratives in the new media realms. So I'm pretty much interested in like getting theoretical and structured background in narratology. So that's pretty much it.
Mm-hmm. Cool, amazing. I actually once curated one show about link to digital called Drawing After Digital, if you mention later. Who haven't we seen? Shilpi, hey, nice to see you again. Or not see
Hello.
you for now.
Am I audible?
But hear you. Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello.
Yes. Simply? Simply? Now we can't hear you, but we did just now. Shilpi? No? Okay. Maybe we'll wait on when Shilpi can hear us. Can everyone else hear me? Yes, okay, okay. Okay, well, so let me see if we, yeah, I think we introduced everybody. Well, so actually, I was supposed to also reread the sort of short introduction to the seminar from the New Center. So I'll do that now in order to complete the video recording as well with that. So actually, this is the first session of the problem of narrative in visual art. And the basic idea is that in the past, storytelling dominated visual arts, but lately the field has been more interested in deconstructing, critiquing, or questioning narratives than constructing new ones. And a lot of the things we now see in painting wouldn't have been called narratives in traditional painting at all, because they give us too little precise elements probably, and some narratologists even say that what is called narrative in art history hardly seems to be narrative to a narratologist who has kind of a stricter concept of narrative. Well, James Elkins explains that narrative isn't dead, but it's a dead issue, that the avoidance of narrative is one of the great dogmas or working assumptions of art production, criticism, and instruction. This is still true to a certain degree, not so much in video art. There's, I think, quite some narrativity. We can think of people like Omer Fast or even Hubbard and Birchler, who make, of course, narrative videos, but in visual arts that operate with, say, one image, in painting or sculpture, there doesn't seem to be that much interest in narrative. And it's more about exploring maybe constellations of materials. Indexicality is maybe still a way to analyze some of these works. The situation where narrative was rejected by a lot of art, and especially in painting, was brought about by pre-modernist scholars like Burckhardt, Konrad, Fiedler, and Maurice, Denis. Burckhardt wrote a famous text about narrative painting, which is actually pretty much a text against narrative painting, where he says that all great artists have always been interested in developing what's specific to their art rather than telling the stories. The stories were basically given from the outside. And that's actually interestingly a narrative, of course, a narrative of art history, which then supports an anti-narrative standpoint and is radicalized by people like Clement Greenberg that someone mentioned, because they're really looking for medium specificity, and narrative exists in so many different media, so it couldn't be specific to any media. Funnily though, Greenberg himself thinks that photography is essentially narrative, which is kind of a funny idea, but he only talks about it in a review about photography. But generally speaking, so there is this idea that painting has been alienated in a certain way, and sculpture has been alienated by the narrative task it has been assigned during centuries, and that finally in the 19th century it can break free and can come to its own kind of autonomy and be occupied with say the painterly aspect of painting or the three-dimensionality, etc. And to a certain degree, you could then also see the development of abstract art as even a radicalization of the first rejection of narrative. Cézanne already doesn't make very strongly narrative paintings anymore. A lot of the artists in the 19th century stopped really telling stories in their painting. And then the next step is to even get rid of the figure in a way, if you say it very, very crudely. While narrative has been rejected by artists across the board, and the time when painters constantly invented new ways to retell well-known stories or invented new ones are long gone. But visual narrative is still found elsewhere. Cartoonists, illustrators, comic draftsmen have never stopped to seek innovative ways to tell stories in pictures. They don't have this kind of problem with, oh, the autonomy of my art form and am I going to lose it and so on, which has been a much bigger issue in, say, fine art. In installation art, there is now, I think, also some works that could be called narrative and that function in interesting ways. So that's also something we'll look at. Yeah, in terms of this first session, it's really an introductory session to the topic, where I even thought it would be interesting to start a bit more generally, also tell you how maybe I got to this topic. And so I shortly start with a screen share before we start discussing these different texts, if there's no question right now. See no one? Okay. You can either raise your hand, because now I can see most of you, or use the virtual tool to raise your hand. Not sure that everybody has been using Zoom, but so that's the two ways. Okay, do you see my screen now, I suppose, right? Okay, so here I'm starting with a painting which I showed several times in art shows, because it has a narrative dimension which we'll start exploring, which is a dimension that has, I believe, often been overlooked in art theory, which is based on traces. So rather than being based on figures in space and the interaction of figures, like in most, say, traditional photographs, here it's about traces, but we'll look into that more closely. The sort of overview of today is that we already heard a little bit of your own narratives about yourself. And I'll give you some of my self-narratives, and then we'll look into the sort of general relevance of narrative, what makes narrative so important in culture, where does it even exist, and then we'll look at narrative in visual arts and images. I called it the problem of narrative in visual arts, but I'm actually always interested more in interesting works, interesting images. Some of these works and images are artworks, but I don't know why I wouldn't look at interesting advertisements or interesting illustrations or comics when they have something to teach us. So I've kind of always tried to bring that in also into art exhibitions and so on. Do I have like this counter light, or does it only look like it to me? Is this better? Okay, but you see the screen share right now anyway. So that would be the kind of parkour. And then when we talk about narrative in visual arts and images, that's really when we dive into the readings for today. So from some of my narratives, my academic narrative kind of started with studying in Munich, logics, theory of science, and philosophy. After my bachelor's, I wasn't so good in logic, got a 3. Anyway, after my bachelor, I applied to École Normale in Paris, got admitted to the Sélection Internationale, which was really cool because it's like this fancy school in Paris, so you're very happy when you get into that, where Sartre went and Celan taught and people like that. But once you're in it, you realize that you still have to do everything by yourself and figure out what you're going to do with this philosophy studies. So that's me at École Normale. Well, what did I do? I actually didn't immediately start a doctorate. I started with a master on René Magritte's word paintings, where I was interested in how we relate to the world in words and images. And then I did a master too. I kind of was tempted again by literature theory. So I worked on aphorisms, nonlinear thinking, and forms of expression of nonlinear thinking. I found it funny to keep the same cover image, like someone had forgotten to change the cover image, but it still worked for this new theme. So it was about like different ways of short forms of writing and how they express a way of thinking that's not linear, like an essay or a novel. At that time, I already started to kind of specialize in image theory. So I had my 20 minutes of fame when I still looked like Kurt Cobain, at least some people said I did at the time, and got to talk about images in the Arte Philosophy show. And it was kind of interesting because the show always uses images. And so this was kind of a meta show where we used images to talk about images, where the show even uses images when they talk about power or the mind or whatever. After that, I started a PhD. That was in 2006. In between, I got into a startup project that's not part of my narrative today, but so finished my PhD in 2013 only. So 2006, 2013, you see that's pretty long to do a PhD, but I did so many different things at that time. And after my PhD, I got a postdoctorate in Vienna, which I called Towards an Experimental Narratology of the Image, which was a research project I submitted, where I thought, well, as theorists, some of you are art historians, most of you are theorists, we always speak about ways people perceive things, in some cases artworks, literature, and so on. Let's ask the people somehow. Let's ask the folk and show them some narrative images and see if they perceive them as we thought they would. So that was an experimental project where I had 250 participants, more or less, who looked at narrative images. And part of what we'll see in one of the sessions will be about these empirical results and what we can learn for theory, because I don't think they're an aim in themselves, but they should inform theory afterwards. Well, that, of course, I wrote a lot of academic essays. Some of them are on the reading list, but I also started writing beyond academia. So art criticism for Art21, now defunct art magazine, where, for instance, I wrote about Hubbard and Birchler, who do these narrative films, videos that I like, or I wrote for Art Press, writing about drawing a lot, being interested in drawing as kind of a minimal form of creating an image and maybe creating a narrative, like, again, with this idea, then when you can figure out how something works in a very small space with a very small means, then you kind of get to the gist of it. At least that's kind of the dream. Also writing for Spike, wrote, for instance, this essay, How Real is the Real, about a lot also about storytelling and about the stories we tell about ourselves and how stories constitute identities. A little bit for the FAZ. So these are things where I write either about art or sometimes about non-art. This is an article for the Standard, a newspaper here in Vienna, where I wrote about this poster of the extreme right-wing party in Austria and tried to show how the fact that they had used these painterly brushstrokes here actually contributed to the meaning, where all the text was about security and maintenance and stability. These painterly brushstrokes were introducing energy. And then I showed how it somehow fits within a whole network of graphic design tendency, which now uses painterly brushstrokes to convey energy. So you don't have a picture that's very energetic, you have a picture that's very stable of this scary extreme right-wing leader, but in the background you have these two streaks that convey energy, and if you think that they somehow convey maybe even the performances of Otto Mühl or other Viennese actionists with blood, then the image becomes maybe even more scary. But in any case, I think in the image it allows to add this idea of energy, this idea of movement, which of course explains why Sony Music is using it as well to convey energy, just a painterly brushstroke. I think there's a history of that, and this is also an advertisement for Air France by Roger Excoffon, who drew a painting, who drew a plane with painting basically, and he tried 150 times until he had it right to convey the energy. So that's something which is already for me the most complex, or one of the most complexest way to convey stories, because you don't convey it in the content, but you convey it actually in the genesis of the image, and the genesis of the artwork becomes the narrative. Curating, I started just after my PhD with this small show in a small space that I kind of rented out. It was called Recouvrement, or covering. It was about artworks that hide in order to better show. And I included already here a work by a fashion photographer, but it's not a fashion photograph, it's just the retouches. And at one point he came to see me and asked me whether I thought it was interesting to show, and I found it very interesting because it suddenly creates this very phantomatic image, and it's very different from the way we think about retouches usually, where we think about retouches as falsifying reality and so on. Showed these works that cover up. This is a work by Benjamin about reproducibility, which you probably all know, which was covered up in black as if something had happened, a catastrophe, to erase the book. Here it's a painting by Gerhard Richter of Mao that has been covered up in graphite. So this was this first exhibition about covering. This is a work. At the time I still made some art, and I stopped afterwards because I thought I didn't need art production for myself, and the world didn't necessarily need my art. So I stopped making art, but that was one of my artworks, Promise. Yeah, then the second show, someone saw that show, a gallerist, and said, don't you want to do a show in my gallery? And the next year I did one, which was about the writing of writing. It was called On the Writing of Writing. So writerly practices in art, where it's not about the meaning that's being written, but about writing itself as making meaning. And sometimes the writing doesn't even express logical meaning or lexical meaning, but it's just like the form of writing, like in Hanne Darboven. The show the next year was Drawing After Digital, which was about how drawing had changed in the digital age, and also how people who still drew by hand actually had changed the way they drew because we were in this digital world. So it was a lot about, it was some plotted drawings, it was eye drawings through eye tracking, but also artworks that reacted to the digital realm, like this one. And also about how our vision has changed because we live in a digital world. Show Me Your Wound is a show where I was a co-curator, where for the first time I was able to kind of bring together old art and contemporary art and create a story out of that. So I felt that, for example, this Baroque sculpture changed when you confronted it to this work by Louise Bourgeois, who is referencing Saint Sebastian, but it's this woman, and Saint Sebastian is always passively receiving, and she's actually walking while she's being hit by these arrows. So how these two works kind of make each other more salient and make different aspects in each other more salient. So that would be this question of narrative in the curatorial discourse, or how the fragility of the body of Christ here becomes even more salient when you see a bomb suit, which is made to protect our fragile bodies, but which at the same time is extremely massive, and the massivity of the bomb suit is underlined. So these are some of those things. And then finally in 2018, I really went heads on and addressed the topic of narrative in an art show with Fragile Narratives, which brought together works of art that were talking about narrative. This was an art intervention change, like you take it out of one context, put it in another, and it becomes something different. And inside there were works that somehow had narrativity, had fragile narratives to offer. But the second step here that I found interesting was to take the curatorial narrative and also make that a subject. So I wrote 3 different stories for the same show. So you found a first intro with the first name for the show, and the works were explained in one way, and then you walked a bit further and you found another intro, and the works were explained differently, and then they were explained yet a third time, so you could look at the same works within 3 different narratives and see how their meaning changed, because of course each work is ambiguous and can be inserted in different narratives, which I tried to explore here. Yeah, this is the last thing I did that closed early this year, which was one very large narrative drawing. And when I gave curators walkthrough, I walked people through one painting, basically, one drawing, which was super large, 2 meters, and had a lot of different stories around the Last Judgments being conveyed in a rather traditional way, looking very much like medieval art by Agathe Pitié. Yeah, so that's it. These are the readings for the different sessions. Today we'll talk a lot about Laocoon, a bit about Greenberg, Elkins, and this basically I gave you because I kind of do this, not really new reading. I think that's the way people initially read a Laocoon when it came out, but then it was kind of forgotten, and people read Laocoon as a kind of showing that a picture could not tell a story at all, or that that Lessing was being purely normative and saying you shouldn't tell a story at all. But I think it's something a little different. That's why I kind of included this text here. Session 2, and I think we'll do the distribution of those who have to give a talk. I don't know how many of you have to give a talk. I heard of one person who said they're a certificate student. Who's a certificate student again? Okay, two, three. Okay, at least 3, 4. Okay, so there are a lot of people who give talk. If you want, I'll do a Google sheet after the thing, and you can choose what you want to present. Is that okay, or do you want to do it now? Google sheet is okay, so we don't have this long moment of discussing that right now. Is that good? Okay, all right. So let's do it. Let's do it that way, so that you can introduce different topics. Well, you can choose different topics. Well, now for an intro. Before the intro, actually, I wanted to talk a little bit about the cultural significance of narrative, because I have the feeling that it would be short-sighted if we spoke about narrative for 4 sessions, but hadn't thought about narrative beyond art first and beyond the way to convey narratives in visual artworks. So there is one book and one theorist I find particularly relevant. There are, of course, a lot, but Jerome Bruner is a good introduction to these questions of how narratives are relevant, as culturally relevant. And what he says, and a lot of people think that's right, he's one of the founder of cognitive psychology, is that narrative is a tool to structure experience. There are all these events we live through, and narrative is one way to kind of make sense of them. We live an event and we somehow insert it into our life narrative. So it's essential for us, and people actually figured out that it's essential for personal identities, that children start telling themselves stories about their life when they're 2 years old. They like go through their day again, and they tell themselves like small stories before they fall asleep. And some of these stories have been recorded and analyzed by psychologists. So for instance, I don't know, I applied for filming school before I studied philosophy, and I wasn't admitted. So this becomes part of my life narrative. Of course, I could be telling myself the story of a failed artist who's now doing art theory. Or I can tell myself the story. I actually do tell myself that I was kind of lucky, because making cinematic films, you always have to find so much money and convince so many people, whereas when you do theory, you can just basically sit in your room and start working. And I prefer that in terms of personality. But that's one event, and this one event, you can actually tell it yourself as a failure in your life, or as something that actually was maybe a lucky coincidence, a new beginning or an ending. And you also see it when sometimes this is negotiated even in culture, as when terrorist attacks happen. I had just arrived in Vienna when Bataclan happened in Paris, and of course the president gave a narrative of the people who had done this attack, who had become terrorists, and said, well, they've been radicalized in prison, they were criminals, and so on. But of course, that's not the story they are telling themselves. The story they're telling themselves about their life is that they were lost, and that they found the path, that they found the right path. So the same event, this radicalization, of course, can be inserted in very different narratives. And then, of course, the consequences you decide to draw based on that, and the political consequences will change radically. If you tell a story of people who of a lack of integration, for instance, you'll make very different choices than when you tell a story of people who just hate democracy and hate freedom. In one case, you try to funnel money into the suburbs, and make life better for a lot of people. In the other, you probably buy better weapons for your police. So the way you frame an event changes radically also what choices you will make. And a lot of this can be explained in terms of narrative. Of course, in religion, it's essential, not only because most of what we believe in different religions are stories, but also because there are stories that are predictive. So again, you'll think I'm obsessed with this, but it was very troubling to me after having lived in Paris for 12 years to see these events. I looked at some of the Daesh videos, and I realized that the stories that the fighters in Syria were telling themselves were actually stories from the Quran. They said in the Quran you can read that there will be a few righteous men that will fight, and the crusaders will attack, and they will be struck, and there will only be a few left, and then they have a new attack and they succeed. And these few people, that's us. So I had never thought of it in that way, but when you have a predictive narrative and people think this predictive narrative is true, and this narrative is sufficiently vague, it leaves space for people to become part of that narrative. So a believer can basically become part of the narrative in the Quran because the narrative is sufficiently open. So of course, to make that point, Daesh in their communications would always use the Crusaders to talk about the alliance of the Russians, of the Americans, and so on and so forth, in order to kind of inject current reality into the predictive narrative. So it's essential in religion in different ways. It's also essential in court. In a way, a judge does nothing else but decide which story he finds more plausible given what is known of the facts, and then tries to see how these stories correlate with law. So a good advocate, a good lawyer, is also an excellent storyteller. And if you look for storytelling in Amazon, you'll find a lot of books that are storytelling for lawyers. It's essential in psychology because we tell our stories to our psychologists, of course. And it's also even essential at the doctor's office, who asks you about the story of your sickness in order to figure out, you know, what happened on day one. Now we have a narrative. We have a narrative of COVID, of the coronavirus. First day, you have a fever, then this happens, then that happens, then you lose your smelling. Maybe the smelling returns about after so many days, and so on. Some people get better first, then they have shortness of breath. So you see, like, again, there's a narrative which is generic, and this narrative can be actualized in different life situations. So, of course, narrative is also essential for identifying symptoms and at the doctors. Given all this importance, especially for identities, it's not surprising that narrative appears in every human society known to history and anthropology. And some people have actually said that we could not only speak of Homo sapiens, but also of Homo narrans, the animal that tells stories with the narrative confirmation of the self that I've already talked about, but also with collective narrative identities. And here I often use the example of Crimea and the different stories that Putin tells and that, say, Angela Merkel tells, right? The story of Crimea is a very different story in the official story of the EU and the story that Russia is telling. In one case, it's a story of a part given to Ukraine during the Soviet Union just for basically administrative purposes that has been traditionally part of Russia and should come back. And in the other case, it's a story of annexation of a part of land that's actually to another country. So here again, there are very important political implications based on the stories in which you kind of insert events and even in this case, places. What narrative does is also quite interesting. Researchers have found that when people listen to stories, there tend to be certain hormones that are released, cortisol, which is linked to focus, but also oxytocin, which is sometimes called the pregnancy hormone because it's strongly present in pregnant women, and when women give birth, and it's supposed to build the link between the baby and the mother. And when people listen to a story together, they have a lot of oxytocin, so it's supposed to link them together, listening to stories in a group. It has emotional effects. It captures attention. When people are going to tell a story, everybody wakes up. It builds suspense, and during the moment of suspense, people are attentive because they want to know what goes on. And I don't know if you live through that. Sometimes you zap. I don't have a TV, but when I go home to my parents, they have a TV, and then I zap. And sometimes I come upon these horrible soap operas. But if there's like some event that triggers suspense, I can't like stop watching. And even one night I went through a TV show I didn't like very much, and I watched basically all episodes. In the end, just skipping fast forward to see the summary of the episodes before, in order to like reply or fulfill this desire for knowing what happens next. So it also lowers, people tend to lower defenses. That's why there are a lot of books about storytelling for managers, because people have realized that storytelling was a great management tool, and that you could convince your troops much better when you told stories than when you just gave arguments and PowerPoint slides. So, sorry, I had this meta moment right now. So I try to insert some stories once in a while to not only have the bullet points. And then, of course, there's also effect on reason. Stories make the abstract concrete. You have like this general point, and then you give an example, right? I tell you that stories are essential for identities, for collective identities, and then I tell you about Crimea, for instance, right? So it makes the abstract concrete by the stories. It's also a form of learning. Aristotle already writes about it in his Poetics. You can also think of Little Red Riding Hood as, of course, a fairy tale that teaches little kids not to talk to strangers and be careful when they're alone in the forest, and not tell the people where they're going, and so on and so forth. And some people even think that phenomena, that emotions are conveyed through stories and learned through stories. Love, for instance, there's this famous aphorism by, I think, La Rochefoucauld or La Bruyère, where he says, "Il y a des gens qui n'auraient jamais été amoureux s'ils n'avaient pas d'abord entendu parler d'amour." There are people that would have never have been in love if they hadn't first heard speaking about love. So basically, the love novels would have taught people what they're supposed to feel when they're in love, and then people have all these emotions and so on, based on maybe the narratives. At least that's a thesis of a German sociologist.
That's also because of memory, isn't it? Memory like creates narrative to make our experience like bearable or significative.
Yeah, I mean, memory is strongly linked to narrative. That's true. We also remember things that were conveyed in narratives up to 12 times more. So there's a strong link between memory and narrative, totally. So now when they try to, for instance, convey certain hygienic rules, they try to insert them in narratives very often in order for people to remember them better. And the last thing is that it creates credibility. And in business, those who some experience with like startup, people always ask, do you have a success case? And what is a success case? It's just a story of where your product or service worked. So it creates more credibility if there's a story that goes with something you're affirming with an argument. Yeah, so that's like for the general kind of introduction around why narrative actually matters as a human phenomenon, where it matters, and when I first discovered these things, I was quite surprised because I tended to think that narrative was essentially a literary phenomenon and a phenomenon like of fairy tales and so on, and you realize that it's actually omnipresent in human interactions, and it's much larger than just an artistic phenomenon. The artistic narratives are actually rather few compared to all the stories that we constantly tell each other. You know what happened, and now the stories that are shared online and so on and so forth. Do you have like, do you want to discuss this like first intro, because now we're going to look more closely at the technical aspects of narrative. There, yeah.
Good question regarding the last part where story makes something more concrete. Just because I was thinking also like the opposite as well, in the sense that metaphors tend to generalize. By using metaphor, you tend to generalize the specificity of an issue, and the metaphor or the allegory becomes bigger and more abstract than the specificity. Oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you perfectly.
Yeah, it tends to make more general and more abstract what may have started out first as a more concrete.
Yeah.
So it's I'm wondering if that's different schools of narrative.
So you would say like the metaphor goes in the other direction? It abstracts out?
Like sometimes like for example, like the story that we say now about the coronavirus, for example, it may start from concrete experiences, but then the tendency now is becoming a meta kind of a bigger theory that's more. So I guess basically it's the relation between concrete and abstract that feels sometimes, especially with metaphor. I was thinking more about Plato. Like the metaphors tend to be used as a way of like kind of jumping these different states of understanding.
Yeah, interesting. I tend to, how metaphor relates to narrative. I tend to think that metaphor is somehow a more, nearly a more complex operation, at least in sort of that to build a metaphor is more often, and narratives are basically, I mean, it's so much easier to tell a story than to make a metaphor. Maybe that's would be a kind of an idea, but yeah. One thing that I know narratologists have been interested in lately is the question of universal metaphors in different stories. And there's this whole idea, which you probably know, metaphors we live by, that metaphors come from the body, and that, for instance, typically people think of anger as a container under steam. So he was boiling with anger and so on, and that this comes up in different cultures. And so even when you see vase paintings from the Maya, classical Maya vase paintings, you see angry characters have fire come out of their mouth. And so some theorists think that there are certain metaphorical ways to express things that have found their way into visual art, and that you can find them in Asterix as well as in Maya vase painting, but not because people who made Asterix read Maya vase painting, but because it's linked to bodily experience, and that the metaphor actually comes from the body. Other comments on this first round? No? Then I'll move a little bit further to some key concepts which I want to kind of like very crudely put out, so we kind of speak about the same things. Or so one first idea is that narrative is a transmedia phenomenon. That has been an idea present since the beginning of narratology. I mean, the history of narratology arguably can start with Aristotle or even with Plato in the Poetics, but the modern narratology, usually people have it start with structuralism in the 60s. So before that, of course, there was Prop with his interest in fairy tales, and Vladimir Prop, who looked at fairy tales, Russian fairy tales, and figured out that many of them had the same kind of structure and the same kind of events, but that the figures changed. So, you know, these ideas you probably heard of the helper and so on and so forth. And so he had the feeling that the story structure of fairy tales was always the same. Narratology since the 60s has focused a little less on story structure and more on the relationship between story and narrative. It's particularly prominent in Gérard Genette, who looked at Proust's research for, what is it, Forgotten Time, à la recherche du temps perdu, where he looks at how the story and the narrative relate to each other. But a basic idea is, since the beginning of modern narratology, that stories can be conveyed in different media. That the structure of a story is independent of the techniques that are used to tell it. Todorov, one of the founding fathers of narratology, who coined the term narratology, actually it's Todorov's term for this new science, the science of study of narrative. He says that we read words, we see images, we decipher gestures, but they convey a story, and it can be the same one. So you could have the same story being told, shown in a ballet, shown through mime, or in a text. And what this one underlying distinction here is the distinction between story and discourse, or story and narrative, with the idea being that story is actually the ensemble of events, the events in this that follow each other, and the narrative is the way these events are actualized in the telling. We can now also make the difference between the telling and the told. The told would be the story. In Russian, we have the difference between fabula and sujet. The fabula is actually the content, the story, and the sujet would be the way the story is being told. So typically I can tell the story, I can tell my life story in 2 sentences, right? Or in these funny things like, once upon a time they lived happily ever after, right? So that's like, you have like a full kind of story packed into a nutshell. And you can tell a story that lasts over 5 years in 2 minutes. But you can tell something that happened later in the story first. You can twist tales. That's actually what the text by Nelson Goodman is about. Twisted tales. So how you can tell a series of events in a different order than the order in which events happen. And when people tell stories naturally, not in art, they tend to follow the order of events in the telling. Fairy tales usually always tell the order of events in the order in which they happened. In a novel, it's very different. The modern novel very often uses this device of foreshadowing, of what Jeanette calls prolapse or analepse. So you're in one moment in the telling, but it foreshadows something that will happen after, or you have the flashback, where you look at something that happened before. So more artificial, more artistic narratives tend to play with that. Of course, one question we could ask is if a single, for example, painting, a single image has a moment, and if it makes sense to speak of a flashback or a flash forward in a painting, and what that could be. Because it's much more clear when you have usually a novel or when you have a movie, what's the present moment. But in a painting, it might be more difficult to make that difference. So that's this difference, which is a fundamental difference between story and the actualization of that story, the telling of that story. Barbara Herrnstein-Smith, but she has been one of the few who has contested that difference and has said it doesn't make sense, because as soon as the narrative is a different one, doesn't that change the story? And narratologists have strongly resisted that claim. And everybody wrote an essay to say that she was wrong when she first said that in On Narrative, this collection of essays by Mitchell that I mentioned earlier. But I always found it somehow appealing, at least, because of course in each telling you have something that changes. If not, it's not another telling. And then you can ask yourself, doesn't every change in the telling imply a change in what's being told? But on the other hand, we have the feeling that the Cinderella plot is also present in, say, Pretty Woman. So the Cinderella story is told in Pretty Woman in a certain degree. So in the end, what it becomes is the question of abstraction. how abstract do you make the story? If you make the story abstract enough, then many different actualizations, many different narratives for the same story can exist, right? But in any case, it is a difference that's fundamental for narratology, but has been contested sometimes. Any thoughts on this right now? A third point I want to make is the question of narratives versus narrativity. Narratologists have been very eager to safeguard narrative. They've been very eager to say not everything is narrative. Don't use narrative too loosely, because they're afraid that if everything's a narrative, nothing is. So then there's an inflation. The concept has to have kind of strict criteria. If you don't have strict criteria, then everything becomes a narrative. And here's someone who defends that point of view, Shlomit Rimken, who says, today narratives are detected in film, drama, opera, music, and the visual arts. The last two are neither verbal nor governed by double temporality, nor strictly speaking, even by events. And then she says, when everything's narrative, nothing is. So these are is a list of her criteria: verbality, double temporality. Events are supposed to be criteria of what makes a narrative. And when you don't reply this criteria, some narratologists like her, or Seymour Chapman, or Christian Metz think, then you don't have a narrative. Yeah, there's someone in the conversation. Let's see.
I was just asking, what is double temporality?
Double temporality. Yeah, double temporality is the idea that there's the temporality of what is being told and the temporality of the telling. There are two timelines that run parallel, and you can say, you can have an event that happens at the beginning of the story you're telling, but you don't tell this event. You tell it only at the very end of your telling. So during the whole telling, people are waiting for this initial event, for instance, that everyone refers to, but that hasn't been told. So double temporality is really the idea of story time versus discourse time, or time of the telling. And narrative would be on this level, on the level of telling. And story would be on a somehow abstract level. Now, the ontology of story is a problem. Where do stories exist? Contemporary narratology, which has had a sort of cognitive turn, tends to think that stories are in the head of the readers, viewers, and that different artifacts can trigger the reconstruction of a story in the head of the people. But earlier narratology seemed to think that stories were somewhere out there, like in a kind of ideal realm. And yeah, one reason why we want to have this distinction is, of course, because we have the feeling that, that the Batman movie was first, the story of the Batman movie was first told in a comic book, right? Something coincides between the Batman movie and the comic book, and one explanation is to say the story coincides. And so yeah, but the double temporality is this idea, and it's a really essential criterion that actually comes from Lessing. But
I have a question as well.
Yes, please.
Regarding the visual arts, there still is a double temporality, but it's just that the second temporality is just a moment of viewing, and not a sequential.
Okay. Yeah, so visual art in terms, of course, it's clear, there clearly is a double temporality in films. So in visual films, of course, yeah, because you have the film having one timeline, 1.5 hours or 20 minutes, and then the film may tell events that are longer and so on and so forth. But even in painting, there's the time of the viewing. And then the question is, what do we do with that? People like Chapman, who are really eager to say that a painting cannot tell a story, they say, yes, of course, we bring our time to the painting, but there's no temporal program in the painting, as opposed to a text or a movie. In a text, of course, I also bring my time, right? In that sense, it's similar to the painting. I bring my temporality to the reading, but in the book, I have an order, and if I read canonically, I actualize every event in the order given in the text. So every reader who reads canonically, who reads the same novel canonically, will read it in the same order. When I step in front of a painting, a lot of people have said, and they have used eye tracking to prove that, Alexei will start in the upper left corner, Nikita will start in the middle maybe, and I might start on the bottom right. And then I might see these things in my order. There are, of course, certain hotspots, things like faces tend to attract early on. But between all of us, if we look at the same painting, we won't have the same temporal program actualizing the painting. There will be differences. So people like Chapman think that this disqualifies painting. So there is a temporality, the temporality of the viewing, but as the person creating work can't really program the order of viewing, at least it's a limit. The question if this limit is devastating and makes it impossible to convey stories in a painting, or if it's just a certain limit in terms of how much can be steered, how much can be governed by the artist. Does that reply to your question? I'm not sure who asked.
Yes. I'm just thinking right now that the temporality of an image of a painting is also very, has to do with the painter. The painter can manipulate this temporality, for example, with intense colors, or of course, it always depends on the painting. Mm-hmm. But I mean, if I draw a red circle, the first thing a viewer will notice is the red circle. Yeah, I agree. No, there are many ways in which a painter can influence this order, and I personally am totally of your opinion. I mean, if you read my text in Diegesis, I'm trying to make the point that paintings can also govern the temporal order of access strongly. And what I believe is that a painter can maybe not decide what you will see first, but what you won't see first. And so there's a relative order of all the other elements to this thing that you won't see first. But that leads a bit further. But what I wanted to say is that even in artworks that if we were to withhold qualifying them as narrative, like Chapman, Raymond Cannon, or Metz do of paintings, it doesn't exclude that they still have narrativity. So lately people have really insisted on the fact that narrative is not just an on-off concept. It's not just something is a narrative or not a narrative. Yes, this difference exists, but some people that are not narratives can have a certain degree of narrativity. So as an example, if you have a still life painting for most people wouldn't be a narrative in a strong sense. Most still life paintings don't tell a story that everybody understands. But when you have a still life painting where a candle was just blown out and is still smoking, this still life painting, everything else being equal, seems to have a higher degree of narrativity, get closer to actually conveying a story than one where the candle was never lit. So what the criteria then would be is eventfulness. Implicitly, the criteria I used is an event conveyed? And then this event can be conveyed explicitly. I can see someone making like this to extinct the candle, to extinguish the candle. Or it can be conveyed through maybe traces. I just see the effect of the event. But in any case, I think it's important to be aware that it's not only about what's a narrative, what's not a narrative. Maybe that question, which was the subject of my PhD thesis, I now think is not so interesting, even though I spent all these years really thinking about, can a painting tell a full-blown story that the people in front of the painting haven't known before? Right? Because that would be the hallmark to say something can be a narrative, it can convey a full-blown story that you don't know before. If not, it would be an illustration. If you have to know the story before, then people could say, well, it just activates the story in your head. You already knew the story. So that's why it would need to be able in a very strong sense of narrative if you want to accept it, this very strict criterion of narrative.
with double temporality and so on and so forth. It would be have to be able. So in my PhD, I actually defined narrative like this. I said narrative is the representation of a chain of events with plot structure. And so the idea is that narratives don't happen. They have to be representations. There's no like narrative in life. It's only when life is retold that it becomes a story, or when it's thought of in terms of story, so represented at least in your head. It has to be a chain of events, chain implying that they are causally linked. They're not just following each other in time. It's not just a sequence of events, but these events have to be causally linked. When you have the bird sings, and then I don't know, the woodpecker comes, and then the baby cries. Most people would say that's not a story yet. But when you say the bird sings, when the woodpecker comes, and therefore the baby cries, then you would have a story, because this therefore creates a causal link. So that's at least a traditional way to see it. Foster has said that the king died and then the queen died. It's not a story, it's not a narrative, it's not telling a story, but the king died and then the queen died of grief is a narrative, because it tells a story, because there's a causal link. The queen didn't just happen to die after the king died. She died because of grief. So that would be one criterion. And in my PhD, and I don't embrace this definition anymore, but this would be a very narrow definition of narrative, to like have very strong criteria of what a narrative is. A chain of events, and then with plot structure would mean that there has to be a problem and a resolution. So that's, yeah.
You don't necessarily need time, but you need like becoming. Would you say that? Something like that? You need like the veer.
I mean, a lot of people have defined time through becoming. So in a way, if there's becoming, then time would be change. You know, this idea that like we only know about time because we see change. So
yeah, Bergsonian idea.
Yeah. So as soon as you have change, you actually have time. So time would be implicit in this definition. Yeah.
But don't you think there's like a pure duration or something like that, that is not non-spatial, or like a duration that is like separated from movement or from transformation?
I don't know, but in any case, it wouldn't affect the definition of narrative. I mean, that would be a question for the philosophy of time, I guess, right? Because I think it's not a question we have to answer in order to define narrative, but I would prefer to remain agnostic on this question. There's pure duration. So that's at least, so that's one possible definition, very relatively strict, and that you can have. Okay, so that's and then narrativity would exist. Maybe you could say narrativity already exists if there's one event. An event would be enough for something to have narrativity. If it's just a state, there's no narrativity. If the event is explicitly represented, there's a higher narrativity than when the event is just implicit. I'm not sure of that, but maybe that. So that would be like some basic ideas that we can question during the sessions and so on and so forth. But so just so we make it clear that it's not only about narrative. We could analyze, for instance, paintings in terms of narrative, even if paintings were not full-blown narratives, because we could look at what augments the degree of narrativity, what brings some narrativity into the painting. And so narrative analysis is possible even if something is not a narrative, strictly speaking. If something doesn't convey a full-blown story, narrative analysis would be useful. And of course, there have been a lot of people who did narrative analysis of paintings. These are a few, but you find, I think, all these references in the text I gave you as well, with Altman, Mikibara, and so on. They all have analyzed visual artwork, single pictures, and sculptures in terms of narrative, but it might be that they just evoke narratives or induce narration. rather than being narratives. Okay, yeah, so that's some of the basic ideas for now. Do you have questions? If not, we start with the text. Like, is there some basic distinction you find problematic, or do you like, can you kind of agree on why, see why they make sense? Is there something that puzzles you right now about all this?
I was just gonna ask, based on the previous question, well, I mean, basically sooner or later we're gonna have to talk about, again, temporality of time.
Yes.
What kind of time is assumed in somebody. So I was just wondering if, was it Romulo who asked the question?
Georgia, I think.
Oh, sorry. Was it like thinking about the kind of more like a Bergson sort of concept of time, where like
Romulo asked about Bergson, yes.
Yeah, like is this like that kind of duration where, like, you know, because we carry all of our experiences already with us, that means that even if a narrative is sequential, still the way that a narrative operates might be more complicated than kind of a linear relationship. But that's just, I think that's going to come maybe a bit later, more about time and narrative.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very interesting question. I think that different, if we already think about the question of visuals, where I feel maybe more comfortable than when we stay on the abstract level, I think there are some paintings that are actually about duration, definitely. And when you think of the depiction of the Trinity, for instance, I mean, it seems obvious to me that this is a painting, when you think of depiction of Trinity, for instance, by Andrei Rublev, it's famous. It's supposed to depict something that always has been, is, and will be. And that's very different from, say, a picture, I don't know what I have here. Okay, it's also relatively durational. It has certain duration. But when you think of this, here, this picture seems to have a short duration. The exact moment when the snake is biting the man. So I think it's interesting to kind of see how different pictures insist on duration more or less, and what implications that has. I think that's the second session. That's really what I would like to go into different temporalities in pictures. But the most traditional, like the problem, like it's post-traditionally, is really this idea of a story having several moments. And now how do I convey these different moments in a work? But maybe we can start with this, with your readings of Lessing's Laocoon. What did you take home from Laocoon? Laocoon it's an extremely influential text. I think it actually defined this idea of double temporality. And at its time, it was super spectacular for people. This is Goethe on Lessing's Laocoon. He says, one has to be a young man to visualize what an effect Lessing's Laocoon had on us. This work that swept us away from the regions of meager contemplation and onto the open terrain of thought. The saying ut pictura poesis, so long misunderstood, was now suddenly set aside, and the difference between the pictorial and the verbal arts was now clear. The peaks of both now appeared separate, however closely they touched at the base. The full consequence of this brilliant thought was illuminated for us as though by a flash of lightning. We cast off all previous critical instructions and judgments like a worn-out coat. We considered ourselves delivered from all evil, and we felt justified in looking down somewhat pityingly at the otherwise very magnificent 16th century. Very beautiful text from the late Goethe, from Dichtung und Wahrheit, when he thinks back of his youth, where this Laocoon, which came out in 1766, was really a hallmark. And it's a hallmark that still today is important for a lot of people. Someone worked on Greenberg, you know that he wrote towards a new Laocoon or a new Laocoon. There were several new Laocoons. And so, yeah, so that's the Laocoon. And what are the ideas that you took away from that? Who wants to start? What are Lessing's arguments? Who read the text? I'm never sure whether I can assume that you're all good students who did all the readings before or not. So I don't want to just call someone to not expose anyone. Maybe you can use the sculpture in order to, or even like the general points in Lessing. Or maybe you can use Goethe. What's the peaks that are separate, and what's the base in which they touch? That's actually in the preface by, I think, preface by Lessing. In what way do the different arts touch, verbal arts and visual arts, and in what way are they separate?
Lessing suggests that the pictorial arts are arts that represent the bodies, and verbal arts are arts that represent the actions.
Okay.
And so the common area between them is the representation. They both represent.
Okay, absolutely, yeah.
Past reality, some.
Okay, and you said bodies versus actions, exactly. So that's an essential difference. Both are representational. So in that sense, of course, a lot of people would say, okay, Lessing was too narrow in his concept of art, right? From today's point of view, we would say, okay, that was still, of course, an 18th century concept of art, where art is imitation. So art, he says imitation, now we would say they depict, they represent. That's common. What's the second criterion that's common to all arts? According to Lessing, preface, in the preface already, what do they want to achieve? The second thing is beauty, okay? So in that sense, Lessing is still, of course, a child of the 18th century. He says art wants to create the beautiful, and it wants to imitate nature, and these beautiful imitations are liked. It wants to even say, he says he wants to deceive us. So beautiful deceptions, that's kind of the definition of art that he still has, and that's super important in order to understand the following arguments, where he, as you said, rightly, Georgia, thinks that visual art should represent bodies, and verbal art, poetry, and in the preface he says that poetry for him is all arts that are temporal, and painting is all arts that are spatial. So that verbal arts should represent actions. And action in this sense, he says, Handlung, I think also includes events. Okay, actions being specific kind of events with an intentional actor bringing about an event. So, well, but we can extend it, I think, to include events. So, but why? Why does Lessing think that the verbal art should focus on events and the spatial arts should focus on bodies?
I mean, mostly he handles this issue in terms of efficiency. Like a sculpture is more efficient if it handles the relationship between bodies. And but I think the whole text, the interesting thing about this whole text is that it is somehow kind of a moral text. Like if you want to be a painter, you should try to represent bodies, which is almost like a caricature of text, given a whole modernism passing and showing us that art can be found in many different places, in many different ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there is this normative aspect that Mitchell insists on when he interprets the Laocoon and says, well, actually, Lessing pretends that he's just making a descriptive argument, but he actually wants to give us norms. but I think the intro actually gives us a different way of understanding that. So of course we feel that like in modernity we have understood that art could be ugly. Even some artists have opposed beauty. A lot of people say that with Goya, with the disasters de la guerra, the disasters of war, we saw that, you know, art could also want and have as a function even to show what's ugly, because it's suppressed and it's part of reality. And so when they don't just, artists shouldn't just please the bourgeois, but they should actually show the cruelty, in Goya's case, the cruelties of war, of Napoleonic wars. So yeah, so art, but Lessing still thinks art should be beautiful, and he still thinks it should imitate. Why does it then make sense, based on these presuppositions, to ask for artists to like focus, for visual artists to focus on bodies, for instance? Like, what's the argument?
Maybe there is something he approaches through the shriek on the face, because it conveys like what tools can be used to telling the stories, and it also implies the temporality. And through the shriek, he also demonstrates that how different of approaches, for example, sculpture and writing, need to take to convey basically the same meaning, and how they largely cannot use the same way of telling the story, and how the temporality plays in it, because there is just one little moment that sculpture has as the focus, and how writing cannot do the same, basically.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's great. So, but the shriek is key. I mean, the shriek was actually what puzzled people about the Laocoon at the time. And you saw that Lessing starts by quoting Winckelmann. And what was Winckelmann's idea, and how does Lessing kind of oppose this idea? Alexa, do you want to follow up? What was Winckelmann's, or someone else, what was Winckelmann's idea, influential idea on the question? The basic question was, this Laocoon statue was found in the Renaissance. People soon figured out that it had been mentioned already in antiquity, that it had to be a famous statue made by Polydor and other sculptors. And they were wondering about why Laocoon doesn't shriek. They said his mouth is not wide opened enough, not widely enough opened in order for him to be shrieking. But he's bitten by a snake. Now, why doesn't he shriek? And then Winckelmann gives the first reply. What is Winckelmann's reply? It's very influential, based on a famous theory by Winckelmann, who was one of the first to say, well, the Greeks had greater minds than us, and they were greater people. And we have their artworks, and their artworks function like time capsules that bring us access to the Greek mind. And what was particularly the greatness, according to Winckelmann, of the Greek? And how does the Laocoon express this greatness? And then we can understand how Lessing kind of radically changes things.
Does it have to do with the way they deal with basically pain and suffering?
Yes. So what's kind of Winckelmann's idea?
I don't remember, but there was something like the difference between, was the binary opposition between the barbaric and the Greek suffering? There's
something like that. He uses a metaphor in this case. You remember? The metaphor of the sea.
So that's, there was something about how about the contrast of the surface and the deep inside, but yeah.
Exactly. Someone remembers? Ebidio?
I was just going to say some of the kind of the first.
Yeah.
It opens up the conversation basically, where I'm just going to read the first page. The general characteristics of the Grecian masterpieces in painting and sculpture are held by Winckelmann to consist in a noble simplicity, in a majestic composure, both of attitude and expression. And then that's the quote he uses: "As the depths of the ocean, he observes, remain always at rest, let the surface be ever so agitated, even so the expression in the figures of the Greeks denotes through every variety of emotion a great and tranquil soul."
So noble, yeah.
Yeah.
What's the edle Einfalt und stille Größe in German? What is it? Noble. You read this like phrase, noble composure, edle Einfalt, noble simplicity, noble simplicity, yeah, and silent composure. Okay, so yeah, that's the idea. The idea is the Greeks actually are such strong people that even when like they're suffering, when their body is being attacked here, they keep their great soul calm, like the bottom of the sea stays calm when there's a storm on the surface. And Winkelmann says we can see in the body. That's interesting. I think it's an interesting observation to say that the body expresses the pain, because you can see the stomach is pulled in. So the pain is not just expressed in the face or in a shriek, but you can see here the pain in the body. But the face expresses the soul. So we sometimes say that, you know, the eyes are the mirror of the soul. Here you could say that the face and the mouth are the mirror of the soul. He has pain, but he doesn't shriek because he has such a great soul. So that's the basic idea. It's, of course, an idea that we now would associate with Stoicism, for instance, right? We would say that the Stoics, they were able to like endure their suffering. And how does Lessing oppose this? And there he goes into reading texts about the Laocoon story and reading texts about heroes who get attacked and who suffer. What does he realize in this reading? He realizes that when a writer writes about that, the heroes shriek. And sometimes it is even said that Hercules was suffering so much that everyone ran away because he was shrieking so much. So Lessing said, wait a minute, Winkelmann, if your interpretation was right, then in a Greek tragedy, people shouldn't be shrieking either. If great Greek heroes don't shriek, then that couldn't happen. However, in verbal text, they do shriek. So the fact that the Laocoon doesn't shriek must have to do with the form, with the visual form. And that's like one of the first introduction of medium specificity, where he will say the difference that is salient here is not a difference in what is being represented, but in the medium that you use to represent it. And when you sculpt a suffering body, you shouldn't have that body display the pain through an open mouth. Why? Because an open mouth is ugly. And when you read about someone shrieking, you don't like hear the voice. And he says when you see it on the theater, they actually make it less. On the theater, it's shorter, but it still feels a lot because you hear it. But when you read it, it doesn't actually affect you. But when you see it and you see this open mouth, it looks like, he says, a hole in sculpture, or just a blot in painting, and that's ugly. So it makes the body look ugly, and it makes the work look ugly. It's a hole, it's a blot. So here we're talking about on the medium level, and it's an open mouth. So it's a, he calls it like the face is deformed as well. So this norm of beauty actually, for him, leads him to say that the Laocoon doesn't shriek. But that's the one element. What's the second argument? And that's the big difference that he introduces. So that's what Goethe finds so relevant. That's where Goethe says, wow, he showed us that actually this saying that was repeated from Simonides since antiquity, that painting is a mute poetry, and that poetry is a speaking painting, where those were treated on a par all the time, and people kept repeating that like it's basically the same thing, that this is wrong. They're not to be treated on a par. They want to achieve the same effect, but in order to achieve the same effect, they need to use different means. Because when you see something, It's a very different experience than when you read it or when you hear it. And therefore you should change the way you express the same thing in different media. So that's the big shift, the big paradigm shift. And I think it's rightly used in this context that Lessing introduced. But then comes the second argument, which has to do with time. He gives a second reason why the Laocoon is not shrieking. Before we move to that, I want you also to appreciate the thought in Winkelmann of like how different parts of the body can convey opposing emotions. So there's something like collage. I mean, and Eisenstein, I don't know how many of you read Eisenstein, the filmmaker's theories. He actually speaks of Laoconism, and he thinks that there is cinema before the cinema. So he says that there are artworks, that are paintings, that are sculptures that already use cinematic effects. And the main cinematic effect, of course, is montage. And he says the Laocoon is actually a work of montage 200 years before cinema appears. More than 200 years before cinema appears. There are different montage elements here. But so this brings us already to the question of time. And how does the Laocoon play a role with this question of time? This is the semiotic argument. So we have this kind of aesthetic argument that we just talked about, basically about beauty. But now we have also a semiotic argument that's linked to the nature of the signs, right? He says the signs with which visual art operates are different in nature from the signs with which verbal art forms operate. And what's their difference? The two basically differences. Did you read the text?
I don't know if it answers your question, but I remember a very interesting point where he says that the agony, I'm going to quote, the agony which is so great as to extort a shriek, either soon abates in violence or it must destroy the unhappy sufferer. So if you choose the time of the shriek, you must also include the time of destroyance or of this becoming violent.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, so that's linked to this, that's linked indeed to this argument, yeah. Which is, it's a very interesting psychological point that he's making here. Which is actually not the semiotic argument yet, but I would call it a psychological argument. He says, actually, what you do when you create an artwork is try to activate the imagination of the viewer. And you have to kind of play the imagination, one could say now, and that's me speaking metaphorically, like you're playing the imagination like you're playing an instrument. And he says, if you show the supreme moment of suffering, shrieking, then the imagination of the viewers cannot go beyond, because you're already showing the worst. So what are people going to imagine? Therefore, he thinks it's better to show the moment just before. Then we can imagine each in our personal terrifying way what is going to happen. Or you show the moment after the climax. Then we can imagine what happened before the climax. And he uses the example of Medea, who kills her own children or eats her own children in order to punish her husband for infidelity. And he says it's not good to show her in the act of killing her children. You should show her when she's still pondering this terrible decision, because then we can imagine the killing, or when the children are already dead. And then you actually activate the imagination. So he says the Laocoon does that by showing the moment where the mouth is not a shriek yet. It's not dying yet. And I think that pretty much the best horror films confirm this theory, because you're always terrified until you see the monster. And in many cases, the monster, then you're like, it was just this, right? Because, and a film like Blair Witch Project operates with the fact that you never see the horror. And then what happens? You fill it in with your own image of the horror. It's each, yeah. Yeah,
I was going to say this. Hitchcock, I think, literally says that the scariest thing that you can find in films actually what the viewers can create in their imagination. So it's not about showing, the actual scene, but like what can be generated by the viewers.
Totally. And
also very, very present in Lovecraft.
Aha. Okay. In written. Yeah, so that's a device. It's kind of an artistic device that he brings to the fore. And do you remember how he calls that moment? There's like a specific key term that he uses, that he coins actually. Calls it the pregnant moment. Because the moment is pregnant with what will happen and what has happened potentially. So for him, the ideal of an artist, because he rejects that artists show explicitly several moments, he doesn't think of comics yet, or he doesn't think much of it, because there are these artworks where several moments are shown explicitly. This is really what we also going to talk about next week. But Lessing thinks that this is kind of archaic. It's not something you should do. You should choose one moment. But then if you still want to convey the story, you have to choose this moment really well. And the best moment is the moment he calls pregnant, fruchtbar, fruitful, could also translate that fruitful moment. And the fruitful moment is the one that doesn't, as he says, how do you call, bind the wings of imagination. The moment shouldn't bind the wings of imagination. If you show too much, then like I'm overwhelmed, I can't imagine anymore. If you show less, you leave space for the wings of my imagination. So that I imagine, and there are two definitions of the pregnant moment, which is kind of interesting. Once he says, leaves as much liberty as possible to imagination. And in another place, he's more technical, he says, makes you imagine what happened before and what will happen after. So the second is much more, let's say, it's a concept of the artist as a puppet player, someone who really wants to govern what the viewer experiences. But the first definition doesn't link the wings of the imagination, seems even closer to a modern concept of art, where we actually cherish ambiguity, where we think it's a sign of great art if the art gives you relative freedom. So that's this argument, the psychological argument, but we still haven't gotten to the semiotic argument. The semiotic argument, if you don't remember, is linked to the structure of science. Semiotics being the theory of science, of course. And Lessing says, well, there are two kinds of art. One operates with temporal signs that follow each other in time, and that's the verbal arts. Of course, also theater, film. Where one sign follows the other. And then there are the spatial arts where the signs are not following each other, but juxtaposed. So the different signs are side by side. When I speak, one word comes after the other. When I read a text, I have this temporal program that I activate, and then each word also comes after the other. I cannot read otherwise. But when I look at a painting, the things are side by side, and as Georgia rightly pointed out, I also need to activate them in time in a certain order, but in the way of being given, everything is given all at once. So that's the one difference. The second difference is a difference that exists since Plato. And it's the difference between natural science and artificial science. Does that ring a bell? What's that difference? What's that major difference? Natural science are signs that are, we also call them motivated sometimes in semiotics. And they are the signs of, for instance, painting or sculpture. And even a simple drawing, if I show you, if I do a drawing as simple as this, and then I write, so say this, right? You have this versus that. What's the difference between the two, the way the two work?
Image refers to the natural phenomena, and while signs, they refer to something, like they just signal something basically, yeah.
Okay, so this, you call this a sign in that case, this? So the image, yeah, how does the image convey its meaning? How does the image represent its object versus how does the word represent its object? Very basic difference.
Like image is emblematic and the text is symbolic.
Okay, yeah, and what does symbolic mean and what does emblematic mean? So because now we're replacing two two concepts by two other concepts. How would you unpack emblematic? And how would you unpack symbolic? How do emblematic signs function and how do symbolic signs function?
Well, emblematic functions visually, like you don't need another system to decode it, because it relates directly to the original. And so like the symbolic structures use like more complicated systems for you to rely on them to get the meaning out of them.
Okay, yeah, so more complicated versus more directly relying to the original. But can we be more precise what this direct relationship to the original is? Because say this, if this is an image of man, how does it rely to like man or to a man? How does it relate to it? I think, yes, more directly, but why is it more directly? Why does it feel more direct than a word like this one? What's the connection?
The resemblance of a physical appearance.
Okay, that would be the traditional definition, exactly. That it resembles somehow a man seen from a certain distance, maybe in the dark, where you don't see the arms, looks like that. A man never looks like this. The word has no auditory resemblance, no visual resemblance. So resemblance would be the key concept that people like Plato already thought were characteristic of natural signs. So where you said emblem, I mean, one term, the traditional term in Plato and for a long time would have been natural signs. And the natural relations are of two kinds. One is resemblance and the other one is causality. But causality doesn't become very important until Peirce, who introduces the index. And the index is a second natural sign, where the connection is not a connection of resemblance, because smoke doesn't resemble fire. However, it's also it has a natural connection because smoke is caused by fire, right? So, so there are two kinds of natural signs. One is signs that have a natural connection of causation and signs that have a connection of resemblance. And then we have artificial signs. Artificial signs are sometimes called symbols, as you said before. And how do symbols operate as opposed to natural signs? Resemblance is on the one hand. What's the relationship on the other? How does the relationship get established between a symbol like man and its object? And by the way, of course, there are visual symbols, right? If I make this heart and I use it to represent love, as we all do on our messaging apps, it's visual and yet it's symbolic. So you first have a decoding in terms of natural resemblance. It somehow resembles the heart, or maybe that's the way it came about in any case. But then you superimpose an artificial meaning on that. And how is this artificial meaning learned? How does it come about? Most people would say it's habit, okay? Convention. So symbols operate through convention. We just decide somehow, or it so happens that people start using it in a certain way. And that's why they can be different, because people can have different uses, right? Hombre, uomo, man, mensch, human, right? They're different words in different languages because different habits, different conventions can exist. And one convention is not better than another. Conventions all are as good as another. Now, not all verbal signs are conventional. There's some verbal signs that also have a natural connection to their objects. Which are they? Onomatopoeia, okay? when in German I call a dog a wow wow, wow wow, or when I call a donkey a ee-ah, this onomatopoetic connection is also a connection of resemblance, right? So there are verbal signs close to verbal language that also have an onomatopoetic connection, or when we say even words like whispering. Whispering also has some onomatopoetic, so it has a kind of, so okay, that's the main difference. And Lessing relies on these two differences. He says verbal signs are structured in time, one after the other, and the connection to their object is an artificial connection, a conventional connection. Whereas visual signs are actually next to each other in space. That's the syntax, we could say the syntax of the sign. And the semantics of the sign is natural, is resemblance, right? So the resemblance, of course, is not an objective resemblance, it's a subjective resemblance. This looks like any other drawing more than a man, in a way. It's on paper. Objectively, it resembles more to all other papers than to a man. But subjectively, in our perception, it can resemble a man. So, okay, so there's this. And now how does this connect back to this whole question of the Laocoon? Well, he says a sign system should be, somehow we could call it homologue to what it signifies. And actions, events follow each other in time. Therefore, a sign system that also has signs that follow each other in time is much better suited, much more direct to convey events in time. And this is a claim that's not a normative claim. It's just, it's a descriptive claim. You could check that. You could, for instance, run experiments where you tell people things like the dessert comes after the dinner, where you twist, right? I first mentioned the dessert even though it comes after. And then you say the sentence, dinner comes first, then dessert. Do people have an easier grasp, a more direct grasp of the second sentence than of the first? If Lessing was right, then this should happen. Okay. So that's, if you want to like have a direct relationship to the perceiver, then maybe this makes sense. So if you should use, in that sense, signs that are juxtaposed to depict bodies in space because they're better suited for that. And then he also says, well, it's very hard to describe, for instance, a flower in words, because when you come to the end of the description, you already forgot what was in the beginning. It's much easier to do a drawing. Or that's why we draw like a path where you have to follow and so on and so forth. And why is the importance of natural and artificial sign? What role does that play? Lessing says the whole power of visual arts comes from their natural relationship, comes from the fact that they are so immediate because they rely on natural signs. When I now use a natural sign to depict temporal relationships, it implies much more work in the viewer. And I lose the whole advantage that operating in natural signs gives me. So Lessing thinks natural signs are more intense. They're more direct, they have a more direct way into our minds. And he thinks a painter would be basically stupid if he abandoned that and started making artificial signs. And there's a second argument in his Laocoon against allegories. Because of course, allegories use symbols. So he says, well, then you introduce a highly artificial relationship when you make, I don't know, the interaction between two women. You see the interaction of two women, and actually it's clemency and justice. And clemency is asking justice to not execute. And he says, well, it's super complicated to understand that these two women mean actually something else, or that this man is a river and this other man is Napoleon. And he says, don't use allegories, because you then make natural signs artificial. They become like hieroglyphs and you lose all the power. Okay, but this makes sense when you think that imitation is an ideal and that immediacy is an ideal. And we could say, okay, maybe we want to abandon these ideals, but within the context where you believe that these things are ideals, his recommendation seems pretty sound, no? Actually, we would now say, I think, it's a theory. I think we could save Lessing if we said it's a theory of imitation, not a theory of art, because we don't agree with his presuppositions of what art should be. But it might be a theory of efficient imitation. And verbal signs are better at imitating probably events, series, and visual signs better at imitating states, bodies, more immediate. So yeah, so the operation is pretty awkward actually, when you think about it, because you have a semantics of a sign system and then a syntax of a sign system, which normally people never think about what the syntax of a sign. I mean, it's not something that becomes semantified, but in Lessing it becomes semantified. He says the syntax of your sign system should fit the syntax of what? The syntax of the phenomenon you're representing, which implies that the world also has a syntax. It's kind of a crazy thought. The world has a syntax, and you should mirror the syntax of the world in the tool you use to represent the world. Yeah, so that's kind of the idea. And the Laocoon finds a way around this. So this is the basic problem. And then the question arises, but how do I depict events with a visual artwork? And Lessing says, well, you activate the imagination. You don't show each moment, you choose the moment so well that people will think of the other moments. Then you don't have to show all the moments. You don't have to go against the natural propensity of your medium. You just use the imagination to get time in. So actually the pregnant moment is the solution. The fruitful moment is the solution to this difficulty that the different sign systems have. Yeah, so so that's the idea. You could, but the Laocoon can be analyzed more in detail. Goethe does it. He says, well, there's a second time layer, which is distributed with these three persons, because you see the three moments of an attack of a snake. The first moment is like the snake nearly just starts attacking you. And this is the little son who is here. It looks like he could still free himself. The second moment is you're already intertwined with the snake, and the snake is just about to bite you, so you're nearly lost. And this boy is already fully kind of taken in by the snake. So this is the third moment. So there are different ways in which this image actually brings in temporality while only showing one moment. Distributing different among the protagonists is a different way to still stay within one moment, but showing several moments, evoking several moments in the minds of the viewer. Yeah, so that's for the Laocoon. Do you have any questions here? Any remarks?
Based on the last comment you mentioned, I didn't notice actually the two people on the side. Mm-hmm. But it's just kind of like that quote on page 152, expressive of the past and pregnant with the future. But now it feels like that kind of becomes more like a platitude now. That now that you've pointed out the two kind of figures, it becomes a bit too simple actually. Like I'm just wondering, like, yeah, how.
Oh yeah. I mean, this idea of the distribution of moments, that's actually an idea that Lessing doesn't make very strongly. He's more interested, it's more Goethe's, because Goethe later writes about the Laocoon as well. Okay. Lessing is really interested in this figure, and how this figure, by evoking the coming suffering and the coming death, actually strongly is pregnant with the future or past. Yeah. So yeah, so that's the Laocoon. And however, what's interesting, it's not only the Laocoon in itself, even though I find it pretty deep in many ways when you look at it for its time, but also the influence it has had. And you see that double temporality is still a criterion 2006 for Schlomidrim and Kemen. It's a criterion for mess. He brings it into the 20th century, where he says the function narrative is a doubly temporal sequence. There's the time of the thing told and the time of the narrative, time of the signified and time of the signifier. This duality invites us to consider that one of the functions of narrative is to invent one time scheme in terms of another time scheme. And Seymour Chapman, who says, a salient property of narrative is double time structuring. That is, all narratives in whatever medium combine the time of the sequence of plot events, the time of histoire, story time, with the time of presentation of those events in the text, which we call discourse time. What is fundamental to narrative, regardless of medium, is that these two time orders are independent. Now, Lessing doesn't use the term narrative himself. He uses action in the text. However, this idea of the double time structure that is present in the verbal arts that depict temporal phenomena actually comes down from Lessing. If we reconstruct that in terms of argument, if we reconstruct what Mess says in terms of argument, it looks something like that. Narrative is the premise. Narrative is doubly temporal sequence. It's doubly temporal sequence. There's the time of the thing told and the time of the narrative. And then the conclusion is one of the functions of narrative is to invent one time scheme in terms of another time scheme. What do you think? Does that sound to you?
I'm sort of like being quiet today just because I'm wondering like where this is going, I guess. And that's not a question, I'm just sort of like intrigued. But I guess like the sentence you just said, like the what sort of hinges in that sentence is the like in terms of, and like when I think of a term, I think of that as the temporal, or I guess we could just say duration after, but it's sort of like right, it's like this some sort of function, like a narrative in terms of another. I don't know. That's all. I just wanted to bring attention because I think that those three words, in terms of, are very interesting in this context.
In terms of another, yeah. He says like monnayer un temps dans l'autre, which is kind of a very strange. Even in French, you don't use that very much. Monnayer un temps dans l'autre, which is then translated to in terms of another. Invent. Monnayer is not invent, but invent one time scheme in terms of another time scheme. I mean, what the problem I see here is, of course, that you observe something and then you say it's the function. Like you observe that there are two temporalities, and then you say, and therefore it must be the function of narrative to bring in two temporalities. Where you're like, wait a minute, like the fact that there are two temporalities doesn't immediately mean that it's the function. So like he's going a step. I think he's going too fast here. And when people make this argument and say, well, spatial arts can't really tell stories because they don't have two timelines, I think what they actually do is extrapolate from the fact that verbal artworks, literary artworks have this double temporality, have double time structuring, and then they think, because this is the paradigmatic example of narrative, this must be essential to narrative. But I think it's what can be called media blindness, or what Liv Hoskin has called a media blindness, where you say, I want to describe a full phenomenon, this phenomenon being narrative. My examples today are going to be literary narratives. Let's look at these literary narratives. What do we see? They all have double time structure, time of the story and time of the narrative. Therefore, double time structure must be essential to narrative. And you're like, wait a minute, all your examples were literary texts. Maybe that's why you think it's essential. But maybe narrative also exists in other forms. And then they generalize out from one specific way one media deals with narrative and make that a general criterion for narrativity. So I think that the criterion of double temporality for narrative is bullshit, to be totally honest. And I would say that a simple scheme of the stock market like this shows that it's bullshit. Because of course you have no double temporality here, but you have time. And of course in more complex ways, you have all these ways of evoking time by here different moments being implicit and traces and so on and so forth. But it's a very influential argument. I think it's important to know about it. And William, so yeah, implicit in your question, where is this going? I mean, the idea is really to try to understand how people have thought about this question of narrative in visual arts. What are the problems that have preoccupied scholars, and then maybe sometimes beyond like just getting the gist of the argument, seeing what else they put on the table, like the things Lessing says about the pregnant moment, about activating imagination. I also try to not always only read for the argument, but also kind of see what else people can bring, what we can learn from them beyond like the strict what's necessary in the most influential argument, or to understand the most influential argument they bring to the table. Or what did you mean, like when you said you're not quite sure where it's going?
Yeah, no, I just sort of posed. I just posed my sentence wrong because I'm just intrigued. This is sort of like constructing a framework, and obviously narratology is like a big framework or something like this. But I'm intrigued, just in general, as to like how you're going to position, I guess, where the class is going. I'm not trying to say anything fancy. I just think it's really interesting because it's almost like some sort of lens or something, or maybe it's not a lens. I don't know. I wasn't trying to make any philosophical argument or even like a quality argument or anything like that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So so that's for this. The other texts. What did you take away from either Elkins or Greenberg? How did you see Greenberg related to that? In what way, by the way? Yeah, maybe Greenberg's good point here. How does Greenberg relate to Lessing? Do you see how Greenberg is a Lessing scholar in a way, or at least basically is influenced by Lessing? Lessing scholar would be.
Greenberg is really focused on the specificity of each medium.
Yeah.
I guess. So how modernist art really just tries to work with the limits that the medium itself provides it, I guess. So I think it makes a case for the separation of different arts, I guess, in the same sense that Lessing does.
Right. And one question is, of course, is Lessing already normative? Because Greenberg seems to be definitely normative. He's like, you should. My point, I guess, was to say that Lessing is actually not normative in an absolute sense. He says, if you wanna have a strong effect on the viewer, then I recommend you to proceed this way. If you want like your imitations to be particularly intense, then use your medium to its best, or to what it can do best. And Greenberg, yeah, indeed, he also pushes further this medium specificity argument that Lessing starts, that Lessing historically introduces. And anyone, I mean, I don't know how familiar Greenberg still is. Sometimes I think everybody knows Greenberg, but I've realized that it's not the case anymore. But it was super influential in modernity, of course. I mean, the Greenbergian kind of thought and the medium essentialism particularly was extremely influential in the way modern art developed. So maybe we can just sum up, at least in this case, sum up the argument. Anyone like wants to sum up the Greenbergian arguments? So Romulo already did a good part of that, but so there's this whole Kantian dimension a little bit, where he says like the Kantian movement is the modern movement, and it consists in looking, using your tools to look at yourself, basically, to introduce auto-reflection. And he thinks arts, in order to become independent, to become truly independent, they have to reflect what is specific to them, have to look at themselves. And he thinks that what's specific to painting is to put colors on a flat surface. And therefore, in order to exemplify this specificity, painters should focus on putting colors on a flat surface. And of course, when you make this argument, it's clear that why Pollock becomes the champion of this kind of art, because you nearly have no figuration anymore, even though Pollock says himself that he's sometimes a little bit figurative, or most of the times a little bit, even though it doesn't explain what he means by that. Emilio?
I was gonna ask, I haven't, in a while since I've done work on this, but I took this class to revisit some of these ideas I had 9 years ago. But the quote that I found on page 28 on the Laocoon, I forgot about this, but like Lessing is very explicit about the material limit that art has. And I don't remember this emphasis on materiality, which is currently what my research is a bit on. I was always puzzled by Greenberg, in the sense because I found that he was very kind of outspoken about painting. And that was like, I felt that he was his main, like, you know, is the two-dimensionality. So the artist that push the limit of that flatness of the surface. So even though he ignored a good tradition of Soviet painters that have done that, 50 years before, 40 years before, there's also like a political dimension to this, that was what was going on actually in the 50s, 60s as part of Cold War, was also like a, who appropriates modernity from who. But that's a bit like a side comment. I was always wondered, like, this materiality. So it is more like an open question, maybe, to think about with Greenberg, is how much he actually meant materiality, or were there like is medium specificity a quality of each medium, a property? So, or is it like an actually materially based relationship? Is it actually material? Because I thought the flatness is more like, like not necessarily like a material quality as much as a property of the medium. And that's why I always wondered, like, where is Greenberg when he speaks about sculpture? Like, I was always puzzled about his work on sculpture. What is the specificity of sculpture? My mathematical kind of thinking is like, well, it should be three-dimensionality, but like that's too simple to, I think, to just kind of jump a dimension on it. Just say like, those who explore the three-dimensionalityness of the sculpture, then must be what makes sculpture modern. But I'm not sure I'm answering your question right now. I'm just more kind of posing a...
No, it's interesting. No, yeah, material. You're right that flatness is not, properly speaking, a material quality, I suppose. So it's all kinds of characteristics, I suppose, of a medium, not just their material qualities that are salient. And yeah, and I think you're right to at least remind us briefly of this political dimension. I mean, people found out that Greenberg was sponsored by basically the American state, or even the CIA, or FBI to do this kind of work later when it was declassified. And even when Danto introduces the idea of the artwork, the ordinary objects turned artwork, he doesn't use Duchamp, he uses Warhol's Brillo boxes. I mean, I think you can definitely see some part of cultural war when people do that, when they ignore earlier artists who have done something like this. So that's for sure. Yeah. Establishing cultural superiority as well. But yeah, so I think, I mean, we already talked, like the basic idea is clear. It's like medium specificity is like you figure out what distinguishes your medium from all other media. In movies, people have thought montage. Montage is the new thing. So good movie makers should focus on montage. So like good movies should essentially be montage based, not on things like narrative wouldn't be so important, for instance, because narrative also exists in literature. So everything that you share with other media can't be your specificity, obviously. And then it's part of the modern quest for autonomy. The argument basically runs like each medium should focus what's specific to the argument or to the medium. What's specific to painting is to put colors on a flat surface. That's P2, and the conclusion is therefore painters should essentially focus on colors on a flat surface. But basically, you can always ask why. Why should you focus on what you do best? And that's actually the question you can ask Lessing. And maybe, Georgia, you were hinting at that earlier when you spoke about development of modern art. You can always ask, but isn't it more interesting to actually do what your medium does worse? To try to figure out how you can overcome the limits of your medium, how you can actually work on what your medium has a hard time with. Isn't that much more interesting artistically?
But isn't Greenberg also subsuming it to the tradition, as he says that the evolution and unraveling of tradition is like a further evolution of it?
Yeah, it's true. He has this historical argument. Like he thinks that's kind of the way things went naturally. It's a logical development kind of, it's like, yeah. And he opens this timeline. And then what I find always spectacular with these kind of readings is that then they reread the old artists and they're like, Rembrandt, what Rembrandt really cared about was putting colors on a flat surface. All this storytelling, that was just what he had to do for people who asked him for paintings. But really what is most relevant in Rembrandt is putting colors on a flat surface. And where people reread the history based on the modern lens, which, yeah, for me, then becomes highly problematic. Attributing intentions and disattributing other intentions would actually, very often within the cultural context, seem much more plausible. I think Rembrandt also wanted to find new ways to tell biblical stories, and storytelling, for instance, was something he also cared about. Not only as we read them modern or late Titian, like that they were all about the paste and the color on the surface. I never found that very convincing. Yeah, but you're right. I mean, there's also a historical and a narrative dimension to Greenberg's argument. Other things that you found in the text we read that you wanted to address?
Emilio said something about sculpture, and I think Greenberg really downplays the role of sculpture. Like when he's talking about how modernist paintings like gets rid of the sculptural aspect. Because even non-representative forms have like sculptoric aspect or something like that, and I think there's a good critique of it by Rosalind Krauss in the through the concept of expanded field, and that's it.
Oh, thank you. Other remarks moving towards the final remarks already, I'm afraid. No, don't see anything. So what maybe some of the like most crucial takeaways today is that one of the main difficulties of visual arts with narrative, and one of the more technical struggles, is how do I depict actions in time? How do I convey actions in time? That's sort of one of the most important, say, technical challenges. And then there's the more normative question: is narrative actually something that's foreign to visual art? Either because it takes away of its autonomy, or because visual art is not very good at it for semiotic reasons. So these would be two kind of different ways to think about it. And one part of the seminar will consist in trying to understand strategies that artists have used to convey complex actions in single frames, in single works. And the other part will be to think a little bit about this question of the narrative as being a problem, a menace to the autonomy. And then, is autonomy a value? I mean, we can also ask this question anyway. I mean, is autonomy such a big deal? Most people today don't seem to think so anymore in arts. I'm not sure that there's still a lot of media essentialists right now. However, even if people have abandoned media essentialism, it still seems, and that's what Elkins is all about, it still seems like there are very few artists who produce complex narratives in single images or in installations or in sculpture. If people want to do narratives, they tend to go to video art. And then one question that will be interesting for us, which is one that I have never really gotten to, but which I would really love to discuss with you guys, is it interesting to try and bring narrative into art forms that are maybe less able, less predestined to work with narrative? What is, maybe we could say history painting, well, they did history painting because they did painting, they didn't have movies. Now we have movies, we have films. Isn't it a good idea that if you want to do narrative, you know what, write a story or make a movie? Yeah. Is there like a good reason to want to, for contemporary artists, would there be a good reason to still want to go into that struggle that Lessing was so worried about? Emilio.
I was just, the more I was thinking about this, my main kind of two takeaway questions based on what we discussed today was, what's the difference between, like, just based also on the reading by Elkins' essay.
Yes.
I was just more curious, like, you know, where do we draw the line between experimental film and video art? Like, that's something I'm really struggling with at the moment, and he seems to poke at that question. But based on the question you just asked right now, I'm wondering, why is it that so many of the albums that I'm just thinking about music right now that try to have like a concept album failed really bad? It's every time you try to do that with sound, and you have like some kind of narrative in the storytelling, that tends to be more often than not a very kind of cheesy result. So I'm gonna think about that more and see if I can think about music albums that tend to kind of do well with this idea of the narrative, but in the concept of, in the format of an album. I don't know if other people have any suggestions.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah, of course, music has the same kind of issue. It also has the issue of temporality. And the opposite issue in a certain way than visual art, because how do you depict in music? is the question. So how do you convey a story in music? It's not, because you have, of course, a narrative timeline. At this, what's the equivalent to the discourse timeline is there in music. But the depiction, the representation becomes difficult. And yeah, I've heard of a new program music, but I haven't listened to it yet. I mean, like program music being the music like Peter and the Wolf, where you, like traditionally, or the Moldau by Dvorak, where you actually have the intention of sort of conveying a story with the music. There seems to be new attempts at that. Of course, when you sing, you have it, but then the narrative is carried by the words again. So it's basically bringing literature into music. The problem is only acute when you have wordless music. And it has been a subject for certain narratologists as well. There's like, yeah. And one thing that you seem to have in music is plot structure, like problem and resolution, like the feeling that, you know, music seems to be able to induce the feeling of expectancy. And then when, I mean, my first experiences with Schoenberg was like that he always creates an expectancy and then disappoints it. Because when you listen to it with like ears that are more used to classical music, then you suddenly, like, he creates expectancies and then he doesn't do the resolution that you would expect in a classical music. So there are a few things that play a role in narrative that still seem to carry over into music. But I never knew if it was the most interesting reading of music, if the narrative reading is an interesting reading. It's one perspective. And for art, the same, of course, yeah. Maybe as one.
I think progressive rock has done a lot in that field, like with concept albums that try to tell some kind of a story. And yeah, it can be cheesy sometimes.
Maybe one last point, of course, just as a disclaimer, I'm not pretending that narrative is the most important thing in visual art or anything. It's just saying that it's one possible perspective and starts with the puzzle that it was so essential for art for centuries, and that history painting was the most noble, considered the most important endeavor for an artist. And suddenly it plays such a small role. So it's linked to this puzzle, and it's a perspective, one perspective on art. The idea is not to pretend that it's like the most important perspective you could have on visual art, but that it's one important perspective, one possible perspective that has maybe been a little bit under theorized lately. Well,
sorry?
Yeah.
If I may add something to this,
yes, please.
Question. In terms of expanding creativity, it is like a valid practice to try to bridge divergent paths or seemingly irrelevant paths. So even the question of what historical painting would look like today is a valid question if you want to expand the limits of creativity, even though the need of this practice is not existent.
I see what you mean. Interesting. Yeah. So yeah, sure. That's a good point. So the need, yeah. Okay. Cool. Other points. If you maybe could do one thing is like send me questions that come up based on this first sessions. Just send them by mail to my New Center address, klaus.spadel@thenewcenter.org, so I can make sure that like we try to answer them in the future, because I don't know what are the aspects that are most relevant to you. Are you really puzzled about the question of why narrative is not such a big deal anymore in visual art, or why it's not so important anymore for visual artists? Are you more interested in the different ways? There is, of course, a certain outline that we defined through the readings and through the course, but I wouldn't want to miss out on what's most pressing, most interesting to you. And maybe after this first class, you have a kind of better idea where it could be going based on what we saw. Okay. Okay, well, then I would say we stop here. I wish you a very nice day, evening, morning, whatever time it may be where you are. And I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll make a sheet for the talks, and you can choose something you want to introduce. Okay, maybe I'll be in touch by mail as well about that. Good. Have a nice evening. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.